Tonight, the silence of the world has become louder than the sound of over 100 missiles. Iran didn't just strike Israel with weapons, it shattered a global illusion. This isn't just about war, it's about truth, betrayal, injustice, and a question the world is too afraid to answer. Why did they all stay silent? What you're about to see isn't in the headlines. It's not what your TV will tell you. This is the part of the story they're trying to bury. But once you hear it, once you feel it, you'll never see this conflict the same again. So don't blink, don't scroll, don't look away, because by the time this video ends, you'll understand why the world is holding its breath and why nothing will ever be the same again. For decades, Israel built its global image on the belief that it was invincible. Its military strength, its cutting-edge defense systems like the Iron Dome, and its deep intelligence networks were marketed to the world as flawless shields against any enemy threat. The world believed it. Its allies believed it. And even many of its adversaries, though quietly, acknowledged that belief. But all it takes is one moment, one calculated strike to turn a myth into a memory. That moment arrived when over 100 Iranian missiles pierced through that illusion, shaking not just buildings, but the very psychological armor that Israel had worn for years. The myth of invincibility wasn't just about physical defense. It was a story, a narrative pushed into global media to keep the world aligned with Israel's power. But narratives can crumble faster than stone walls when truth enters the battlefield. Iran didn't just launch rockets, it launched a challenge to decades of one-sided dominance. And this challenge wasn't reckless, it was strategic. It wasn't a desperate act, it was a message planned in silence, delivered in thunder. Every missile that slipped past Israeli defenses carried a warning that no wall is high enough, no radar sharp enough. When the will to resist has matured and the patience of a nation has run its course, for the first time in years, images surfaced showing the Iron Dome overwhelmed, civilians shaken, and the media struggling to spin the story without acknowledging the damage. That's when the myth began to unravel. When people across the world, watching their screens, saw that Israel could be hit, that Israel could bleed, it triggered a shift in perception. Suddenly, those who always felt helpless realized that power wasn't as absolute as they had been led to believe. And this realization is dangerous to those who thrive on control. It's dangerous because once fear is removed from the heart of the oppressed, they riot. This is not about celebrating war or glorifying violence. It's about revealing the imbalance that was hidden under layers of media control and political manipulation. The myth of invincibility gave Israel room to act without restraint, to strike without consequence, to dominate without question. But now that myth stands cracked, and the world has seen the fracture. Iran may not have won a war in one night, but it proved that the narrative was false, and that truth can still roar louder than propaganda. What's broken now isn't just concrete, it's the confidence of a regime that once believed it could act without ever being touched. The myth is broken, and from its pieces, a new reality is being written. Iran's missile strike wasn't just a military maneuver aimed at Israel. It was a message carefully crafted for the entire world to witness. The precision, scale, and timing of the attack made it clear that Iran was no longer willing to operate in the shadows or play the role of the silent observer. This was a bold declaration, not just of retaliation, but of identity and resolve. The message carried by every missile was simple. Iran is no longer afraid. For decades, it had been portrayed as the isolated villain, demonized in global media, pressured by sanctions, and encircled by military threats. But this act flipped the narrative. The hunter became the hunted, and the silence of submission was replaced by the roar of defiance. This strike wasn't launched recklessly. It was calculated, intentional, and designed to show the world that Iran is not just a regional power. It's a global actor with influence, strategy, and courage. The fact that it was willing to confront Israel, a country backed by the West and shielded by American support, sent shockwaves through international corridors of power. It challenged not just Israel's defense, but the very balance of fear that has shaped Middle Eastern politics for decades. The world has always viewed the Middle East through a distorted lens, shaped by Western narratives that glorify some and villainize others. But this strike forced a pause. It forced journalists, analysts, and governments to reconsider the simplistic image of Iran as merely a threat. By striking back with precision and purpose, Iran reframed itself, not as an aggressor, but as a nation defending its dignity, avenging its martyrs, and standing up against unchecked dominance. It proved that resistance isn't about chaos, it's about courage rooted in justice. It exposed a deeper reality that when a nation stands on principles, when it believes its cause is just, fear loses its grip. Iran was not just speaking to Israel, it was speaking to every oppressed nation, every silenced voice, every Muslim heart across the globe that had been waiting for someone to say, enough. And that message landed. Social media erupted with support, not just in the Muslim world, but even among neutral observers who saw the imbalance of power being shaken. Streets in Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen echoed with cheers. Even in countries with cold diplomatic ties to Iran, people saw something more than politics. They saw defiance with dignity. In one night, Iran repositioned itself on the world stage, not by asking for attention, but by commanding it. And the silence of its enemies after the strike only confirmed one thing. They weren't ready for this kind of message, because deep down, they never thought Iran would dare to speak it so loud and clear. The global media response to Iran's strike on Israel revealed more than just headlines. It exposed the hypocrisy that's been deeply rooted in the narrative machine of the West. For years, every action by nations like Iran has been painted with one brushstroke: aggression, terrorism, instability. But when Israel strikes, when it bombs, when it occupies, it's labeled as self-defense, security operations, or necessary retaliation. This double standard has been protected, nurtured, and broadcast to the world with such consistency that most people didn't question it. But the night Iran launched over 100 missiles into Israeli territory, that carefully guarded hypocrisy was shaken. Instead of global condemnation or outcries for justice, the world witnessed something eerily different: silence. Major media outlets reported cautiously, with vague headlines and soft language. They avoided using the word attack for Israel's previous actions, but labeled Iran's response as escalation. This selective language wasn't accidental. It was strategic. It aimed to preserve the image of Israel as the victim, even when its own actions had provoked the response. The silence wasn't just a lack of words, it was complicity. It was the unwillingness to admit that for once, the narrative didn't fit the mold the world was used to hearing. Iran didn't strike in the dark. It waited, it warned, and when the time came, it responded with clarity. But instead of engaging in a balanced conversation about why this happened, much of the Western media scrambled to shift the focus. to stir fears about regional escalation, rather than address the real roots of the conflict. This tactic wasn't new. It's been used for decades to control perception, to shape who gets to be seen as the oppressor and who gets labeled the oppressor. But something changed this time. People weren't buying it as easily. Social media, independent journalists, and voices from the ground began to tell the truth, the unfiltered, uncomfortable truth that the mainstream refused to highlight. Videos emerged from the scene. Voices from Gaza, from Tehran, from Jerusalem began to flood the digital space with a perspective that had long been ignored. They spoke of injustice, of imbalance, of how the world had turned a blind eye to occupation, to siege, to suffering. Iran's strike wasn't just military, it was symbolic. It forced the world to confront a reality it had ignored. It shattered the illusion that power always defines justice. And it held up a mirror to the media that had for too long distorted the truth. This silence after the storm, this calculated quiet from world powers and institutions that usually flood news cycles with statements, revealed how uncomfortable they were with the world where the oppressed found their voice. And in that silence, millions heard something louder than ever before, a call for honesty, for balance, for truth to be seen, even if it makes the powerful uneasy. The media could hide behind words, but the people had already seen what needed to be seen, and once that veil is lifted, it rarely falls back down the same way again. The military implications of Iran's unprecedented missile strike on Israeli territory go far beyond immediate damage or retaliation. This event has fundamentally altered the perception of military dominance in the region. For decades, Israel was seen as nearly untouchable when it came to security. Its Iron Dome missile defense system was praised globally, its intelligence agencies revered, and its military deterrence firmly established. But in a single coordinated act, Iran sent a message not just to Israel, but to every nation watching. The equation of power in the Middle East is shifting. What was once assumed to be invulnerable has now shown cracks, and those cracks are no longer just symbolic. They are strategic vulnerabilities that the world cannot unsee. When Iran launched over 100 missiles, the world held its breath, expecting perhaps the usual interception success stories. But this time, many of those missiles hit their targets. They penetrated Israeli airspace, triggered sirens in major cities, and caused real, tangible consequences. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. It proved that despite Israel's billion-dollar defense infrastructure, no system is foolproof. It showed that even the most technologically advanced shields can be overwhelmed, and that when push comes to shove, deterrence based on invincibility is a myth. This realization didn't just affect Israel's military strategy, it sent shockwaves through the intelligence and defense communities across Europe and the United States. The scale and precision of Iran's strike demonstrated its ability to coordinate a complex long-range attack. It wasn't impulsive or chaotic. It was calculated, timely, and highly synchronized. This shows that Iran's military capabilities are not as outdated or scattered as many Western analysts previously believed. On the contrary, Iran displayed a degree of tactical maturity that challenged years of propaganda portraying its forces as disorganized and inferior. With this strike, Iran forced the world to reassess its entire understanding of Middle Eastern military dynamics. It highlighted the growing sophistication of missile technology in the region and hinted at how rapidly the balance of power could tilt if others in the axis of resistance were to coordinate or replicate similar maneuvers. Furthermore, the implications extend into global arms policy and alliances. Countries that once blindly supplied weapons or defense systems to Israel now have to reevaluate the effectiveness and return on those investments. Regional powers, who once felt the need to submit to Israeli dominance out of fear, may now feel emboldened. This changes the game not only militarily, but diplomatically. It opens space for new alliances, for deeper regional cooperation among resistance groups, and for greater confidence among those who have been under pressure to remain silent or compliant. Iran's strike didn't just damage buildings, it cracked open the illusion of uncontested military superiority. And when illusions break, new realities are born. This moment marks the start of that shift, and the world's military observers know it, even if they aren't ready to admit it out loud. The global media response to Iran's missile strike on Israeli cities has revealed a deep and uncomfortable truth about the way narratives are controlled, shaped, and often manipulated. When over 100 missiles are launched, when air raid sirens echo across cities, and when civilians are injured on either side, one would expect round-the-clock headlines and widespread coverage. But in this case, the global reaction was strikingly muted, cautious, and in many instances, dismissive. This silence speaks volumes. It exposes a pattern of selective reporting, where aggression from certain countries is magnified, but resistance from others is minimized, ignored, or quickly reframed to protect existing geopolitical interests. Iran's strike, no matter how calculated or symbolic, disrupted a media machine that has long favored one narrative. Western media outlets, particularly in the United States and Europe, have long framed the Middle East through a singular lens, where allies are always defending themselves and adversaries are always the aggressors. Iran's retaliatory strike didn't fit neatly into that script. It wasn't wild or indiscriminate. It was a message delivered with precision and clarity. You can't continue decades of provocation and expect silence forever. And yet, instead of reflecting on that deeper message, many outlets chose to downplay the impact, redirect blame, or quickly pivot to stories that would once again paint Iran as irrational or rogue. The world wasn't just watching missiles fall, it was watching truth get filtered, diluted, and repackaged to fit an old, crumbling narrative. This silence also highlights the hypocrisy in how human suffering is portrayed, depending on who is experiencing it. When Israeli civilians are affected, the pain is personalized, humanized, and rightfully given global sympathy. But when civilians in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, or Iran suffer, they become numbers, statistical footnotes in a larger story. Iran's strike was a reaction to years of such imbalance, not just in warfare, but in storytelling. And the muted coverage proves that the media gatekeepers are still unwilling to let go of their bias, even when the facts demand a more honest confrontation. Furthermore, the silence of world leaders adds another layer to this revelation. While some nations issued generic statements urging restraint, very few addressed the root cause that led to this escalation. Iran wasn't acting out of nowhere. It was responding to targeted assassinations, covert sabotage, and a campaign of economic warfare. Yet that context was largely absent in most diplomatic responses. The world's reluctance to acknowledge Iran's grievances, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, shows how deep the political alignment is when it comes to protecting certain interests. But this moment demands is not just acknowledgement of what happened, but a reassessment of how truth is controlled. Iran's missile strike may have targeted military and symbolic sites, but it also struck the foundation of a biased narrative that has dominated global understanding for far too long. The question now is whether people around the world are willing to look beyond the headlines and ask, who gets to tell the story, and why does that story always seem to favor the same side, no matter the truth on the ground? The sixth key point focuses on the psychological and symbolic victory Iran achieved through its missile strike on Israel. While physical damage may be measured in broken buildings or casualties, the deeper blow was delivered to the image of invincibility that Israel had long projected. For decades, Israel has positioned itself as militarily untouchable in the region, backed by one of the world's most advanced defense systems and unwavering support from the United States. Yet when over 100 Iranian missiles penetrated its airspace and reached their targets, that aura of untouchability was shattered. The world saw a different image, one where even the most fortified can be reached, where even the most supported can bleed. That shift in perception is powerful because it dismantles fear-based dominance and replaces it with a new sense of balance and psychological warfare. This wasn't just a military engagement, it was a moment of reckoning. Iran's decision to respond openly and forcefully was a calculated risk aimed at reshaping regional dynamics. It wasn't about destruction, it was about sending a message that deterrence works both ways. The psychological impact of this action will ripple far beyond the battlefield. It empowers other nations and resistance movements across the region, proving that it is possible to challenge a seemingly unstoppable force when the cause is rooted in dignity, defense, and justice. Iran's resolve underlined that strength isn't just about hardware or technology. It's about willpower, unity, and the courage to stand when the world expects you to stay down. In homes across the Muslim world and beyond, this act sparked a sense of regained confidence. People who had grown used to watching their nations humiliated, sanctioned, bombed, or discredited felt something shift. This wasn't about glorifying war or vengeance. It was about the dignity of having a voice that echoes back after years of silence. For many, it was the first time they saw a direct response that didn't come from underground factions or hidden resistance, but from a sovereign state standing tall in the daylight. The psychological impact of that image is incalculable because it gives birth to belief. The belief that change is possible, that balance is attainable, and that fear is not a one-way street. Meanwhile, inside Israel, the psychological landscape has also changed. The confidence of citizens who believed Iron Dome and strategic alliances guaranteed safety has now been replaced with a degree of vulnerability. Leaders must now consider how such attacks affect morale, not just politics. How do you assure a population when the enemy they've been taught to mock just show the world it can reach your doorstep? That's a question no missile defense system can answer. It's a question of perception, of psychology, of the mind's battlefield, where victories and defeats last far longer than any explosion. In this moment, Iran did more than strike military sites. It struck a nerve. And that nerve runs through the hearts of not just those in power, but through millions of observers around the world who now see a crack in the wall that once looked unbreakable. What we've just witnessed is not merely a military operation, it's a message carved into history. A statement that shook the balance of power and shattered the illusion of invincibility. Iran's bold retaliation sent more than missiles. It sent a reality check to a world used to silence from the oppressed. This was not a war for land or ego. It was a war of narratives, of justice, of dignity, and Iran stood up not just for itself, but for every voice that had been silenced, every soul that had been stepped on, every nation that had been told to bow. The psychological tremor of this moment will last far longer than any explosion. Israel, long armored with political immunity and Western backing, has now tasted what vulnerability feels like. And for the oppressed, this was more than just news. It was a glimpse of hope, a sign that power without accountability can be challenged, that resistance backed by truth can roar louder than arrogance built on oppression. Everyone watching, this is a wake-up call, not just about geopolitics, but about standing firm when the world wants you to fall. We are entering a new era, and in this era, silence is no longer an option. This isn't about celebrating conflict. It's about understanding the cost of injustice, the strength of unity, and the courage it takes to defend one's honor in a world designed to crush it. Thank you for staying with me till the end. Your time, your heart, and your attention are what keep these truths alive. May you continue to seek clarity. May you always stand on the side of justice. And may your voice never tremble in the face of oppression. Good luck on your journey, and never forget, the truth is louder than fear.